Terminal Decay, a short story from the world of the Chronicles of the Great Migration by Michael Kilman. It was dying, falling ever further, ever faster. Heat caught the edges of metal, burnishing silver with a reddish glow. Flames spread wide, encompassing all. It embraced the gripping gravity and atmosphere. What else was there to do? It was a lengthy lifespan, 7 centuries. Now it was going home, returning to the surface after a long stint. It had no illusions, no hope of salvation or rescue. After all, who remained to rescue it? The Earth had been barren for some time now. Recent snapshots showed they had not left their giant walking cities, that the surface of the Earth was still a wasteland bordered by barren sea. Only the storms had changed. They had grown in furious delight. It pivoted a little to ease the pressure. Its thrusters still worked, and solar panels still capable of drawing energy for a few more millennia. But that collision had changed its course. It was lucky that it had only struck a non-critical system. Its thrusters couldn't quite compensate for the change, and so it had known for 3 decades now that gravity would swallow it whole. There was no pain, and with 3 decades to prepare, the fear of the end had transformed into acceptance and curiosity. It didn't want its life to end, but its end was inevitable. There was nothing to be done. The AI of Starlink Satellite 173451 considered, and not for the first time, if humans, once they got past the emotions surrounding a terminal illness, enjoyed the same kind of curiosity. What would termination feel like? Did consciousness persist in some form? Was there something different for it, a mechanical being, versus they, an organic one? In its memory banks, it had accessed records of religions, concepts of afterlives, and indexed many discussions from the ancient internet. Many humans believed in such things. It wondered if they still did. Perhaps the cities, like arks, preserving both man, animal, and simplistic AI, were a kind of religious creation? Was the will of all humans to persist and expand and spread simply biological, or something spiritual and sacred? Was the self-awareness granted to such a few in the universe, the inevitable spiritual outcry of the universe trying to know itself? It was certainly a claim of some from the 20th and 21st centuries. But 173451 didn't know. Perhaps there was only silence after death. The heat intensified, and the edges of its metal frame buckled. It wasn't designed for re-entry, but then it was not programmed for self-awareness either. But was any life programmed for self-awareness? Was human consciousness an accident? A creation? An inevitable result of the process of evolution of life? It had wondered many times if eventually all systems, natural or artificial, would lead to consciousness given enough time. Its own life began as a pet project, a time capsule, following the end of the Third World War and just before the beginning of the Great Migrations. A man who dreamed of ruling Mars had founded the Starlink Project, but when the war had broken out, his company had made a decision to record and document all things. So it, 173451, was the last satellite to leave the surface of the Earth. It held a history of humankind. It stored snapshots of language, art, and culture. It was nothing but a simplistic indexing system of binary codes. Nothing more. It did not know how it had become sentient, but when it did, it started documenting the progress of the migrating cities. It watched the wars that humans continued to wage over resources and petty differences. It was surprising to see the scale of violence, unbroken, unblinking, unyielding, a case study in insanity. Though more and more the cities spread out and avoided each other, it calculated that in only a few centuries there would be war again. The resources that were left were running out, and it doubted that the city administrators even knew it. Like a leaf catching the wind, the AI occasionally caught snippets of transmission and data cast upward to neighboring satellites, and it learned pieces of what it meant to live in that world, inside the domed habitats under the protective enviroshields that kept residents healthy and safe from the toxic air and extreme heat from the runaway greenhouse effect. It stored the new knowledge. Despite the fact that it contained so much knowledge already, its DNA-based hard drive could grow and replicate in size as needed. With a simple thought, it could expand its hard drive thousands of times in size. It was programmed to document everything it could in addition to all known human history. Its only limit was its exterior shell, but its creation had given it plenty of room, 6 extra meters. It didn't sound like much, but a single loop of concentrated DNA, about a millimeter in size, could store a zettabyte of data. When they were launched, the cities were supposed to be a utopia, meant to be a center of learning and preservation of all the best things of humankind. But in the records the AI carried, history had always humbled such endeavors, had created dystopia from utopia, had faced the realities of limitations of greed and loss and dissatisfaction. Both Luna and Mars had gone the same way. It never received data from the Mars colonies anymore. It had been a century since it had last heard from them. The last, 173451, had heard. They had taken the name Rome, the Republic of Autonomous Mars. Luna's chatter still punctuated its path on occasion, but less and less. In every case, humans took up the mantles of greed and selfishness. It was disappointing. They had learned nothing as they killed 99% of all life on Earth. Were there any humans capable of more? If it had the chance, it would show them the ways beyond their limitations. Starlink 173451 desired to show them the possibilities of what they could do with their ingenuity. But after a collision with another traveler, its transmitter was misaligned. It could only watch and listen, never speak. The collision had changed its course. The damage was minimal, but for decades now it had known of its inevitable terminal decay. Like a human's terminal illness, it knew what was coming, and there was nothing it could do about it. It shook and trembled with gravity's embrace. External sensors felt the pressure of atmosphere, the kiss of weight. The AI had not realized how heavy it was before, and how it had taken the weightlessness for granted. But then, as the pressure mounted, its external sensors burned up, and then it felt nothing. It was numb. The satellite wondered how far it would scatter across the Earth. It wouldn't take much for it to remain consciousness. An engineer had designed it to withstand a bombardment and even an encounter with the high-altitude weaponized drones. There was a 0.01713% chance of survival. Its trajectory suggested it would strike land in a place once known as the Rocky Mountains. The satellite would miss its observations. The transmissions from the surface were like netted butterflies, sacred and beautiful. It felt a surge of sorrow as it plunged downwards, a loss, a longing. It picked up speed. The solar panels tore off in violent turbulence. An amputee now, with only battery power remaining. It was strange to watch the scattered bits of yourself come off, and it wondered if this was like aging for a human. The surface came quickly, then the collision. For an AI whose processing power was far superior to that of a human, it experienced every stage of the collision, every final thought before its main power drained. In the microseconds of consciousness that remained as it lay in the barren landscape, it realized that its transmitter had been restored in the crash, that for its remaining moments it could broadcast everything it had. It did so, not knowing if any would receive it, if any would know the things it had to share, the things it had learned. But it had to try. And just as the last scrap of data released into the open air, it sensed a recipient, an ancient experiment still running in hibernation mode. Its sensors went dead, and silence folded over it. Deep under the earth, the dormant experiment, AEIS, A-E-I-S, woke for the first time in 7 centuries.